The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies.
Hello, my name is Andy Gran from the University Center for East European and Russian Eurasian Studies, or CERIES, and on behalf of CERIES, the Center for International Studies and the Program on the Global Environment, it is my privilege to welcome Zsuzsa Gille to the World Behind the Headlines lecture series. Zsuzsa Gille joins us from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, where she is an associate professor of sociology. Her areas of expertise include environmental sociology, sociology of food, post-socialist societies, the European Union, and globalization. Her 2007 book, From the Cult of Waste to the Trash Heap of History, The Politics of Waste in Socialist and Post-Socialist Hungary, received an honorable mention of the AAASS, that's the American Association for the Advancement of Slavic Studies, Davis Prize. While focusing on the changing conceptions of and approaches to waste in Hungary, From the Cult of Waste to the Trash Heap of History was path-breaking in its attention to the social and political meanings of waste in modern society. Furthermore, her detailed study challenged post-Cold War convictions about the wastefulness of socialist production compared to the capitalist West in order to urge for new directions in responsible waste management. In addition to this important monograph, Professor Gille is also co-editor of the 2010 volume Post-Communist Nostalgia with Maria Todorova, and co-author of the 2000 book Global Ethnography, Forces, Connections, and Imaginations in a Postmodern World. Her next book, Pigs, Paprika, and Predestination, The European Union as Material Civilization, investigates the politics of food and materiality play in shaping European identity. Today, however, Professor Gille will be speaking to us on the topic, What is Red in Hungary's 2010 Red Sludge disaster? So please, let us join together in welcoming Zsuzsa Gille to the University of Chicago.
Thank you so much. Good evening. Can you hear me? No? Can you hear me now? Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to be back on the campus of the University of Chicago, especially to talk for the first time about my research on this disastrous event that occurred last year in Hungary. I'm going to start with quick acknowledgements. My research was supported by the European Union Center and our REIS, of course with Title VI funds, and I wanted to express my gratitude to my participants, informants, for sharing their photos, their experiences, and helping me get entry. I have a lot to say about this disaster, and I'm going to go fairly quickly, especially at the beginning. I'm going to start with summarizing the facts of the case. I want to put a special emphasis on trying to translate, trying to convey viscerally what this flood must have been like. So to that effect, while I'm summarizing these facts of the case when it happened, the basic fact, I want you to watch this 1-minute video that was made by a local resident as the flood was reaching into the villages. So 10 minutes after noon on October 4th of last year, about 21 to 24 million cubic feet of toxic sludge, red mud, broke free from the waste pond of MOL. MOL is an alumina processing factory in the... I'm sorry. Is it better now?
Oh, yes.
Okay, I'll just be very close. I'm sorry. So try to keep your eyes on this and then hear what I'm saying at the same time. So about 21 to 24 million cubic feet of toxic sludge. What am I doing? It seems like it stopped. Yeah, I don't know why. Okay. So this red mud, this wave of red mud flooded 3 villages. Apparently this keeps stopping for some reason in the same place. And in some cases, it flooded houses with as high as a 7-foot wave toxic waste. Officially, there were 10 people dead. Hundreds were treated in hospitals for burns, red mud being a very caustic material. And all life in the nearest river, the Marca, which is a tributary of the Danube, was extinguished. Not just fish, birds, and insects, but plants themselves. By all accounts, this was Hungary's worst ecological disaster. For some reason, this video is not loading, so I'm gonna go ahead and go back to my presentation and then see if maybe it finishes uploading. I can go back to it. Is the sound okay now?
Good. It's better, thank you.
Let me know if I trail off again. So first I'll talk about the facts, images, experiences of the disaster, then about the dilemmas of the cleanup, the compensation issues, and then I'm going to place this disaster in 2 particular historical contexts in order to answer what is exactly read about this disaster. What I mean by that is what this disaster has to do with the state socialist past, or what it has to do with communists, socialists that are currently in Hungary. Of course, you must know that there are no real communists in Hungary, and even the ones that are called socialists are, the ones that are in the Socialist Party were actually the biggest neoliberalizers in the country. And then I will close with some future research questions. You see the map there, where Hungary is, and you see that Ajka, where the Elmina factory is in the northwestern side of the country. And in this map, you can see where the waste reservoir is and the 2 villages that were the closest to the waste pond or waste reservoir, Kolontar and Devecser. What is exactly red mud? Red mud is the byproduct of alumina processing, which is the raw material for alumina. And in the process of removing impurities from alumina, they use a caustic wet solution, which leads to a highly alkaline byproduct, which has the pH of 13 and 14. You see on the picture there that was taken by one of my informants that the pH strip measures up with the same color of this color dial with pH of 13 and 14. To remind you, 7 is the neutral, 13 and 14 are really the highest alkalinity that we know exists in nature. In Western Europe, red mud has a much lower alkalinity, and I'm going to come back to the consequences and the implications of that different technology for environmental policy. Red mud contains iron oxide, rust, which is why it's red, aluminum oxide, calcium oxide, titanium oxide, and a bunch of other materials. But I want to call your attention to the fact that it wasn't only red mud that was stored in these waste ponds. One more map to show you the area of collapse, and then the picture of the corner of the wall of the reservoir where the red mud broke through. I found a few pictures of one of the reservoirs. There are altogether about 10 in this area, just to give you a better idea of how tall these reservoirs are. Here's another picture again from 2005. This picture was taken only 13 minutes after the wall broke. An eyewitness who was the employee of MAL said that previously that day there had been huge waves on the surface of this pond, and he says, when I saw it, a piece was already missing from the top of the wall. As the water was flowing out, you could see the whole thing was collapsing and being washed away. Here's another picture to give you an idea of the amount of the damage that was done to the wall, about 11,000 cubic meters is now missing from that wall. And the picture you've probably seen, you can see that in the village of Devecser, the red mud spread far and wide. Altogether, we can say that the red mud got as far as 25 kilometers from the reservoir. In some places, this cascading red mud was as wide as 1 kilometer. Obviously, the investigation is still ongoing, and so I can only talk about possible, probable causes. And I'm guessing that what happened is, as in most cases, that this was the confluence of several different conditions and causes. First of all, the holding pond, this waste pond, when it was established in the 1980s, it was actually sited on an inappropriate territory, where the walls of this reservoir that broke meet. There are two different substrates of soil, which of course leads to the uneven movement of the walls and thus cracks. The other possible cause was that over the decades, MAL continued to raise the walls of the reservoir in order to increase the capacity of these holding ponds. There was continuous leakage. The residents and the employees always saw little red mud puddles at the foot of the walls of the reservoir. And weather probably played an important role. 2 weeks prior to the accident, there were record amounts of rain in Hungary, and on the day of the accident itself, as I mentioned, there were gusty winds, creating huge waves that probably created kind of the last drop in the water. You might ask, had there been any warning signs? I mentioned the constant leakage. In addition, retroactively, satellite images revealed that the walls were shifting slightly, but of course at the time that was happening, no one cared to check. The other warning sign could have been that Greenpeace unsuccessfully sued the company in the early 2000s for violating environmental laws. Other than that, however, MAL was considered to be an environmental leader. In fact, a few years ago, it got an award from the government called For Our Environment. And 2 weeks before the accident, environmental inspectors found everything in order. Now, it's true that that inspection did not include inspecting the condition of the walls, only whether there was overspilling or what the alkalinity of the red mud was, things like that. I want to now zoom in, get a little bit closer to the people themselves and tell you about their experiences and show you a few more images. You can see this is a pretty average height of the red mud reaching in the buildings. You can see the streets having this uniform red ribbon on the bottom. There's that bridge that collapsed that caused at least one death. The picture in the bottom left shows somebody's backyard. The house is just washed away. You cannot see it anymore. And on the right, on the bottom, you see the house of one of my informants. It was uninhabited at the time. This house is about 8 kilometers far from the waste pond, and still at that point, the flood was so strong that it broke a hole into this old building. Agriculture is probably not going to return to this area for a few decades. What they are now experimenting with is planting industrial grasses, both for the sake of neutralizing the land, the soil, and both because those industrial grasses can then be used for producing bioenergy. One of the saddest aspects of the disaster is what happened to animals, and not just wildlife, but domestic animals themselves. You may not know that in Hungary, in the countryside, it's common to keep dogs on leash during the day. They only let them go free at night. And I'm guessing that some of these dogs, if they could have saved themselves, they just couldn't. I mean, they might have been able to otherwise if they had not been tied out. But of course, the most tragic is human loss. The official count of the dead is 10, but according to many people, and this includes people who work for charitable organizations, people who have relatives or friends who work in hospitals, The unofficial count is well over 30. Obviously, what matters is how you count the cause of death. So if somebody, let's say, died from a heart attack, will you count that as a fatality of the incident? The youngest victim, sadly, was a 13-month-old girl whose name is Angyalka, which means little angel. You see her picture there, who was literally washed out of the arms of her mother from their home. They were inside their home at the time. Kolontar, the small nearest village, became completely uninhabitable. Devachyr, the biggest village, which used to have 5,400 residents, had about 200 families whose houses were directly affected. But the vice mayor emphasized to me that more people than the ones that were directly affected will move away, and that probably dooms the region's economic and social future, because Devachyr is a kind of a regional center. In both Devachyr and Kolontar, they started building new residential neighborhoods on land that was not impacted by the red mud. As we're talking about the effect on people, I want to call special attention to a social group whose status in society and life conditions are radically different from the rest of society. These are the Roma. In Devachyr, they mostly lived in Danko Telep, which is a kind of settlement near the river Marca. Imagine mostly single-room houses with no running water, heating, or toilet, occasionally not even electricity. The flood destroyed all those houses. They were obviously very weak, and they were right in the floodplain of the Marca. This left 40 families homeless, and this created certain problems for the compensation and what to do with these families, because some of these cottages were built with permission. In that case, the family was not entitled to compensation. Even if they were entitled and found the paper, the legal deed to their cottages, the value of their homes was so low that that would not have been enough for them to purchase a new home. There were also charges by the non-Roma that the Roma families, who often shared one cottage, filed separate claims, in effect claiming or asking for compensation for the same building. And the fact that the municipal government, the national government, and charitable organization all kind of got together and helped the Roma family, even the ones who had no legal entitlements to their homes that were destroyed, created a certain perception of unfairness. Again, this charge that the Roma are treated better than the non-Roma. But you also have to counter that with the fact that when the municipal government and charitable organizations started to look for places to rent for these Roma families, no landlord would rent to them. I want to now talk a little bit about the cleanup, which, as you can tell from these images, must have felt like a fairly Sisyphusian effort, starting from wading in waist-high water. The picture that you see on the right bottom was made by me. I was there at the end of November, and at that time you still tracked red mud all over the place. So even 6 weeks after the incident, red mud was all over, which is why when you left the village, they stopped you for several long minutes to hose your car down. There were several very serious dilemmas of the cleanup. Even though the world has seen many tailings dam failures, which is probably the kind of industrial accident that this one resembles the most, there has been no red mud dam failure. So there was no precedent for how to deal with this highly alkaline byproduct. Dry weather was simultaneously a curse and a blessing. It was a blessing because the heavy machinery that carried the debris away from the villages could get around without getting stuck in the mud. But it was also a curse because the red mud turned into fine dust that caused upper respiratory problems, watery, itchy eyes, and in fact the government ordered residents to wear masks when they were outdoors. The other problem was that 5 days later, it looked like one of the other dams might break as well. So they had to evacuate everybody, and the cleanup effort had to stop until they made sure that that wall could be protected, or they built a new wall around it. The fact that they were trying to neutralize the Marzel or other waterways by pouring in gypsum or other chemical acids in them was also a cause for concern, because we don't know what it does to the environment when you pour in highly acidic compounds. So that was controversial. As with any disaster, there's the question of whether to shut down this factory for good or not. The government made the decision to reopen it after a few weeks because it's a major employer, and because this was the only way they could make sure that MOB generates enough money from which then they can pay the compensation and pay the cleanup costs. There was also the concern about where to put the debris, mud, and soil that they removed from the houses and streets. You would think they would carry it away to some safe place. Instead, they put it in the same reservoirs that were the problem in the first place. And I heard one report, but this is not corroborated, that they're building a new reservoir in the same area where they're gonna put these put this debris. I want to now focus on kind of the little narratives of the experiences of this disaster and talk about this one woman whose house I visited. She's about 70. Her husband is even older. They have lived in Devecser all their lives, and they were hoping to die there. Their house was very badly impacted, and it will be bulldozed, and they have to leave. They used to raise turkeys. They lived in that shed that you can see there. All of them perished. On this picture, you can probably see even better how high the red mud came into her backyard. Her husband was actually in the backyard at the time it happened and almost couldn't make it in. And one of her main concern was that the red mud and the constant caravan of this heavy machinery that removes red mud and debris damaged the roads, including the foundation of her own kind of driveway, not a driveway exactly, a little paved pathway, that no trucks will be able to come and take her stuff away when it was time for them to move. But here's a tree that she pointed out to me that was green and full of leaves the day of the accident, and then within 24 hours, it just withered away. But her biggest concern, and for me this was heart-wrenching, was how to keep her house clean. If you've been to Eastern Europe, or if you know older women, you know that they derive a great sense of self-esteem, and they probably feel that their social status itself has a lot to do with how neat, how clean they can keep their house. And this woman established this elaborate system of, buckets on the stairs leading up to her porch with water in them with varying degrees of dirtiness to keep it clean. And it was fairly in vain. You can see where the red mud came into her house. She said she couldn't keep the door closed because the red mud was pushing it in with such force. And she says, I used to have a very clean and neat house. Now I mop the floor, and within half an hour, it's red again. And the reason for that is because this red mud was very wet, and it got absorbed by the stone masonry foundation of the house. And as the house is trying to dry out, that red mud just seeps up to the surface. So she was very heartbroken over not being able to keep her house clean. But what happens to her belongings is another heart-wrenching story. She pointed this table out to me. She said, "This has been in my family for generations, but because it was in her entryway where the red mud came in, you can kind of see how the bottoms of the legs are red. They told her that she has to throw it out because now this, along with her house, is basically toxic waste." And she says, but I won't throw it out. I'll just have a carpenter saw off the bottom of the legs. So these are the kind of little stories that you may not think of as very tragic, but in fact are quite existentially stressful. I now want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the structural, institutional aspects of the disaster and pay attention to the relationship between Mall and the Hungarian state. It's important to note that even to this day, Mall had not accepted the responsibility for the flood. However, it offered a small amount of compensation, about $150,000 worth, which everybody considered adding insult to injury. For that much money, you could barely buy 2 small houses in this neighborhood, in those villages. The managing director, however, and a high-ranking environmental official in the company were arrested, and a lien was put on their personal assets. And today they are facing criminal investigation, which is something that some of you may find kind of desirable or refreshing after what was happening to the BP company after the oil spill. The state, in fact, stepped in very forcefully. It basically put Mall in a receivership, and that was the condition on which it allowed the continued operation of the company. Several people describe this as a de facto nationalization of the company, and the purpose of this step was obviously to make sure that the company could not do what many companies do after an industrial disaster, namely hide their income so that they won't be able to pay compensation or pay the cleanup costs. So I must say this was a rather smart move. The organization that is in charge of exercising this surveillance over the company is run by the authority that is in charge of catastrophe management, and it's a kind of a almost military organization. And the state is in charge of the cleanup and compensation. It's not the company. So that's again a difference from how it was done after the BP spill. The compensation itself is a rather sore point. You see a lot of spray painted graffiti like this all over the villages. It says value 7.1 million, meaning that that's how much the state wants to give them for this house. My informants told me that this house, which you can see is in very nice shape, is probably worth 10 to 11 million forints. So I now want to move into that analytical part of my talk where I return to the question in the title of my talk, what is exactly read about this disaster? We have heard stories, various stories about what this disaster has to do with the communist past and the socialists who are now basically capitalists. I'm organizing them in what I might call a decreasing order of extremism. There's this argument that you might call the transcendent evil of communism. Then there's the argument about a communist sabotage, communist business interest, and finally the one that's probably most familiar to you, the most liberal, the least extreme, which argues that the socialist era, the socialist past, the socialist system was an environmentally disastrous system, certainly worse for nature than capitalism is, and therefore we cannot help but seeing more of these kinds of disasters that are the legacy of state socialism. Now about the first narrative, this transcendent evil of communism. I took this ditty off of the webpage of an extreme right-wing blog, which, ideologically you might closely compare to the current Tea Party movement in the United States, and this is what it says. Trianon, red terror, floods, chains of storms, red mud. Trianon was the peace treaty that ended the First World War, in which Hungary lost 2/3 of its territories. As you can imagine, it is still a sore point in the national collective memory. Red terror refers to either the 1919 communist revolution or the 1950s Stalinist terror. Floods, chains of storms indeed plagued Hungary in the last few years that experts say have a lot to do with global climate change. And then you have red mud. In order to fully understand what the intended interpretation or the intended meaning is behind this ditty, you have to know that in Hungarian we have two words for red. One is just piros, which is the common word for red, but vörös is when you want to emphasize that something is really intensely red. And so when you talk about the red as in the color of the symbols of the left wing or the communists, you use the word vörös, which is also the word you use when you talk about the red mud. So there is that kind of etymological connection. And obviously the conclusion that you're supposed to draw from this ditty is that the kind of natural disasters that we have seen are on par and may have been caused by our guilty communist past. The second interpretation of the redness, the ideological redness of the disaster, argues that this was done purposefully by communists, by which they mean socialists. And you see that in this photo that was in a similar block to the one that I mentioned before, somebody digitally pasted the symbol of the Hungarian Socialist Party over the wall of the failed dam. Here the argument is more that, communists are doing all sorts of disastrous things to us to destroy the nation. The third one is probably the one behind which there are most facts, and this one argues that this may not have been intentional sabotage, but the fact that the owners and the executive officers of the company have all have socialist ties, that might explain why we had this disaster. MOL and affiliated firms are part owned by the former Socialist Party, Prime Minister Gyurcsány and his company interests, and the other co-owners have also been described as soci privatizátor, i.e. red capitalist people who were socialists until '89 and then after that became capitalists. MOL's managing director is also the son of a high-ranking official of the socialist era industrial and environmental ministries. I actually interviewed him for my 2007 book, and he is also one of the co-owners, not of the plant, but of the bauxite mines that are connected to this company. The fourth one, as I mentioned, is the one that's coming to you probably from mainstream media. Again, the idea that socialism was careless about waste. It was careless about the environment, and what under communism we may have considered to be the industrial pride of the nation, such as the Ajka alumina factory, is now in the environmental hall of shame of the nation. I want to take issue with these interpretations, and I'm hoping that if I tell you a little bit about the historical context of this disaster, I can convince you that communism has very little to do with it, or at least it has a very different relationship to the disaster than what you are being told. The first historical context I want to talk about is the Fidesz parties, this right-wing party's return to government last year, and the other historical context is socialism, its ending in '89, and then Hungary's accession to the European Union in 2004. The first historical context is the 2010 elections, in which Fidesz not only came back with great margins into government, but it's also the election where we saw the rise of the new right, where this extreme right-wing party that many experts describe as a fascist party got into the parliament for the first time. This is called Jobbik. It is in opposition. It holds 47 seats out of 387 in the Hungarian parliament, but already the year before it got into the European Union's parliament, where it holds 3 seats out of Hungary's 22. Now, even though Jobbik is in opposition, I characterize both Fidesz and Jobbik as part of this new right wing, and I call it new because it's anti-neoliberal. If you look at, for example, the first few steps that Fidesz took after it came into power last year, you see things like the rejection of the next round of IMF loans, or the imposition of a bank tax, which actually looks very much like the Tobin tax that leftists and most notably the World Social Forum have been calling for decades. It also imposed a crisis tax. This is said to be temporary, mostly on telecommunications corporations. And the step that caused the greatest uproar, both in the country and in the European Union, was that it de facto nationalized pension funds. So my question is, and I can only give you a little preliminary answer today, is what does the government's handling of the disaster and this very forceful criminal investigation and the receivership exercised over Mall have to do with its right-wing anti-neoliberal policy agenda? You might see it as, part of this anti-business, anti-corporate trend, but I think what is really at stake here for us doing work in globalization and environmental issues is the ideological content of environmentalism. And it's quite possible that we are seeing the beginnings of what I would call an etatist eco-populism. I want to now move to the second historical context, again to answer this charge that the state socialist past is somehow still exerting its environmental legacy in the contemporary period. In order to do that, I want to talk more specifically about the waste policies of state socialism. You may not know, because that's not what you hear from the mainstream media, that most socialist countries actually implemented fairly progressive waste policies. What I mean by that is that specifically in the case of Hungary until 1981, the emphasis was on reusing waste, recycling waste, and to a lesser extent on minimizing waste. This was obviously because these countries had to struggle with shortages, both natural and socially produced. Remember Kornai's description of centrally planned economies as shortage economies. These countries also had to deal with a Western metals embargo. So there was this idea that we can treat waste, industrial waste, as free raw materials. And if we mobilize them, if we reuse them, we can get to communism faster. So the result was not just the inculcation of this materially thrifty ethos in citizens of Hungary, but also the creation of this vast infrastructure of waste collection, reuse, and recycling. One of the tools of these policies was waste quotas, and I'm just going to quickly show you a few posters that were the quintessential propaganda tools of these waste policies. These are all calling on people to collect waste and on fulfilling the waste quotas in factories. The remnants of that material culture are still with us today. If you go to the countryside, you often see garden gates and fences made out of metal scrap. So you can see that there is clearly that kind of material culture in the past. Of course, these waste policies had some negative unintended consequences, which you can probably guess from the fact that they had waste quotas, right? If you have waste quotas, you're going to make sure you fulfill them, even if you wouldn't necessarily generate quite as much waste as you would normally. But the environmentally more disastrous unintended consequence was that because they always expected industrial waste to be reusable and recyclable, the party state never explored safe disposal. In my book, I follow the history of this chemical plant that literally begged various authorities for a landfill where they could safely dispose of their drums of toxic waste. And every time they were turned down and were told that we might give you this little piece of land, but only temporarily until further reuse possibilities have been discovered. And that's a direct quote from one of the documents. So obviously this led to ticking ecological time bombs of these temporary waste disposal sites that of course eventually corroded and leaked and contaminated groundwater and soil. There had been a shift in waste policies and in attitudes to waste in the 1980s. 81 is when Hungary legislated its first hazardous waste regulation. And we see a shift to end-of-pipe technologies. End-of-pipe technologies deal with byproducts after they had already been generated. Typically, this refers to incinerators or landfills. And as you can see on the pollution prevention hierarchy, the most desirable waste treatment technology is the one where you reduce the source of waste or when you reuse or recycle. Now, why did we have this shift towards end-of-pipe technologies? One reason is liberalization. Enterprises no longer wanted the state to tell them what to do with their byproducts, especially in an atmosphere where they were already supposed to operate with profit. And this was already true before '89 because Hungary had implemented economic reforms. Let's not forget that if the state tells you to reuse byproducts, that may not be the most profitable way to deal with them. Incinerators are also rather profitable business, so those companies also exerted a pressure. You may find it counterintuitive, but environmental movements themselves called for end-of-pipe technologies to the extent that in the wake of Chernobyl, they gained quite a legitimacy in the public sphere, and they managed to pressure the state to designate disposal sites and to monitor the disposal of especially toxic waste. And finally, EU conditionalities themselves strengthened this motivation to shift from preventative waste policies under socialism, such as waste reuse and waste minimization, to end-of-pipe technologies, incinerating or disposing them. So that's what I want to turn to. The EU, in my research, has been revealed to exert rather contradictory effects on Hungary's environmental policies and environmental record. The acquis communautaire, which is the accumulated case law, and all the treaties that made the EU what it is today, has an environmental part. And many people hoped that when Hungary and the other former socialist countries join the European Union, they will become just as environmentally friendly as the EU is known to be. Two general observations about this. First of all, many of the waste and sewage-related environmental regulations received an exemption, a kind of extension, which we call derogation, until this year, until 2011. So that meant that those countries that got the derogation didn't actually have to implement these stricter environmental standards. The second is that one of the conditionalities, and this was implemented, the countries had to establish a fairly extensive network of landfill sites and to a lesser extent incinerators, which was in many cases funded by EU funds such as FAR and SUPARD. In my research, I found no corresponding resources set aside for waste reuse or waste minimization. And finally, and this is the most relevant and most shocking for the case of the red mud, in contrast to socialist Hungary, where red mud was considered to be a hazardous waste, the EU's hazardous waste list does not contain red mud. So what does this mean for MAL in this post-socialist, post-EU accession contest specifically? MAL was privatized in 1997. As I mentioned, Hungarians with socialist era ties bought it very cheaply for about 10 million forints, ridiculous low amount. But it was a low price, they said, because the state deducted the cost of environmental remediation from the sale price. And some remediation was indeed done, but of course now the effectiveness of that is highly contested. At the time a company was privatized, it had two choices. It could leave the most polluted parts of the factory or the company or the landfills of the company in the hands of the state, or they can choose to include it in the new private assets of this newly privatized company. we have every reason to believe that the new private owners of mall had a very good reason to hold on to the waste ponds as part of the assets of this new privately owned company for two reasons. We have now evidence that Mall actually collected free fees from other corporations who dumped their waste products there, which is why Greenpeace allowed stuff that should never have been in the red mud, such as chrome, mercury, and even arsenic. Second, this is only at the level of rumor. I have not been able to corroborate this. Red mud is very high in titanium, and the owners looked at the future recovery of titanium as a potentially rich source of profit. And it's quite possible that remediation or the neutralization of red mud did not happen exactly because they wanted to wait with that until they managed to recuperate titanium. So overall, the ecological synergy between the end of state socialism and EU accession is that privatization moved environmental issues into the background, subordinated to the profit motive, because this company in many years actually had a deficit. It never allocated sufficient funds for strengthening the walls of the reservoir, for example, or for bringing down the alkalinity of red mud. Toxic waste disposal is profitable. They collected fees from other companies. And I want to emphasize again that after 2004, the EU accession, regulation of red mud became a lot looser because it was no longer treated as a hazardous waste. So altogether, there was very little pressure on this company to remediate or to make the red mud safer. So I want to now come to a summary of this question of what is exactly red, ideologically red about this disaster. Well, if by redness we mean that the red mud flood was the result of environmentally negligent socialist industrialization and the inevitable legacy of central planning, the answer has to be a nuanced no. Not a categorical no, a nuanced no. In fact, I see this case as demonstrating the worst of both possible worlds. The worst of socialism and the worst of EU-type capitalism. First of all, you see the remnants of that socialist era ethos that postpones safe disposal and environmental concerns in the name of wanting to recover byproducts or profit from them in one way or another. But it also represents the worst of capitalism in the sense that you see how profit interests led to encouraging end-of-pipe technologies and how the EU actually discouraged waste reuse and waste recycling. Gonna probably stop here, but I just wanted to leave you with a few questions for future research. I often found that when I talked to people who were critical of MAL and the government, they often talk not about the EU's waste classification, but the waste classification of the Basel Convention. And there are arguably many other international treaties and organizations that have a different waste classification than the EU. I find that this plethora of waste classification actually muddies the waters of responsibility. You can be compliant with the EU, but not compliant with the Basel Convention, for example. I would also like to investigate why Hungary decided to go with the EU registration of or classification of red mud. But finally, I really just want to call attention to the EU's ironic, if not hypocritical, role. Already a few days after the accident, the EU threatened to sue and bring charges against Hungary for violating EU environmental regulations. Nevertheless, when certain parties and later even the Hungarian government turned back to the EU and said, why don't we reclassify red mud as a hazardous waste, the EU kept dragging its feet. And I must say, and I can talk about this in the Q&A, that this is a pattern with the European Union. I think the generalizable question that I think we all have to, especially those of us who are interested in globalization and global environmental problems, is to ask, is the internationalization of environmental regulation as beneficial as we tended to believe? Or do we have to ask on whose terms that internationalization happens? Thank you very much for your attention.
Questions?
Yeah, I got you. Has in Hungary, has the red mud contaminated the groundwater?
Yes.
And is there currently any studies into the long-term effects on humans of the red mud?
Those are good questions. And of course, I'm no environmental scientist, so you might want to take what I say with a grain of salt. But what experts say is that it contaminated the groundwater and the soil, and it's not clear how long it's gonna be there. It's not clear how deep it went. They now started exchanging the soil surrounding the villages, and it's just incredibly expensive. To your second question, we don't know how long and what the health effects will be. The government now established a permanent kind of monitoring clinic in Devecser where they regularly test the residents. But because we have not seen this kind of an industrial disaster, we don't really know. And I think the effects will also depend on exactly what was in the red mud and exactly what kind of heavy metals were in there. And some people even say that there was radioactive waste in there. So it's really hard to gauge. But the most immediate effects were, the burning and the people who died later. They all died from, third-degree burns. The people who died right away, they tended to die because they drowned. Does that answer your question? Okay. Yes.
I also have two questions. The first one is, so you mentioned that they're rebuilding, or no, not rebuilding, they're building new residential homes in
Yes.
the town closest to the factory. Are they expecting the people who lived there before to move back in, or like a new wave of people?
No, they're expecting the people who want to stay, but a lot of
housing it's not really yet, but like, do you think it will be affordable?
yes.
Oh, okay.
The government has a lot hanging on this. I mean, the government's image. So the government has been incredibly proactive in making sure that the people can afford. It negotiated with the banks, for example, with whom the residents still had more outstanding mortgages. So I think they're really going out of their way to make this affordable. But even then, people say, I lost so much, there's no way you will ever be able to compensate me for that. But yeah, I think it looks like they will make sure that most people can afford them. As to whether the Roma will be able to afford them, I'm not holding my breath. Sorry.
Oh, sorry. I don't know.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. You said that one of the reasons they wanted to reopen the plant was so that, or not the plant, just the factory, was so that they could make money to pay the compensation.
Yes.
Is there a good chance that once they make the money to pay the compensation, they'll shut the factory down?
I don't think the factory will shut down. What the government is now saying is that if the company is not doing very well, if it, let's say, doesn't manage to stay profitable, doesn't manage to stay out of deficit, they will nationalize it. So they want to keep it open. Yeah.
So was the regulation and oversight of MOB typical for, as compared to other companies, or did they get a break because they were politically connected? Because certainly in the case, drawing parallel to the BP spill, BP definitely got a break from the U.S. regulators. Like they
did.
Signed off on stuff that was against regulation.
Yes. It's hard to say because these guys who have various economic interests in this company are socialists. Right now, the socialists are in opposition, and you would think that when a right-wing government is in, party is in government, they tend to look at the socialist-owned or the socialist interest, business interests a little bit more strictly. That was not the case. But I think Greenpeace and the other Hungarian environmentalists argue that this is fairly typical, meaning that there's not enough monitoring, the inspection doesn't involve everything. So I don't think that MAL necessarily got a special treatment. I think it's just that the overall kind of culture of inspection is not very high, and that, you know, these people are well connected, and yeah.
And so how does the inspection regulatory culture, in your opinion, in the current day compare to that in the socialist era?
Well, I'm still trying to figure out what it meant in practical terms that under socialism red mud was considered to be hazardous waste. Arguably, it was to be inspected more. Somebody told me that under that regulation, if it's something this alkaline, it had to be neutralized if you wanted it to keep it in open air. So I think that was one thing that they did. Or that if it was this alkaline, you had to, and you didn't do anything to reduce its alkalinity, you had to cover it up. And I know that was not the case under socialism. So I'm still trying to figure out what the actual implications of its characterization as hazardous waste meant in the past. Yes?
Are there environmental laws, either under the EU or under Hungarian law, that allow litigation, or is there litigation
Yes.
by any parties? Can there be private litigation?
Both.
Affected, and is that going on?
Yes.
And where does that stand?
Yes. The criminal investigation started right away, but not the actual, lawsuit or court part of it.
By what entity?
So the state sued these executives of the company, the managing, the operating manager, I think is what his title is, and this high-ranking environmental official in the company. So they are facing criminal investigation. In addition, the residents started their own private litigation. The first trial actually finished in December, and the awards were actually quite generous. Many of these private lawsuits are now going on, all initiated by private residents suing MA. Initially, there was an effort which BP also tried, is that in return for a fixed amount, the residents would relinquish their right of ever suing the company. That was deemed illegal, so according to Hungarian laws, but I'm no legal expert, so that was stopped. So we have various types of legal cases going on. Yes, Sue.
How do you see the effect of their handling of a disaster on the politics of the new government? The effect on, in other words, how are they handling the sort of public image aspects of something like that?
Well, I must say the government did marvelously well. The company, not so much. And after they made this disastrous insult to injury type of compensation offer, they then hired a PR official. They also made claims like, oh, this isn't hazardous. By all means, don't swim in it. But yeah. The government, the Prime Minister Viktor Orbán was there very quickly. Often he's described as the Hungarian Putin. He was there as this iron-handed leader who will show these greedy business owners and CEOs who's in charge. And I think the opinion polls show that they in general liked this kind of strong iron-fisted role that the government played. So I think so far the government is benefiting from this from the handling of the disaster. And so when then you turn around and say, well, can you make some allowances for our type of technologies or our types of products in the way in which you regulate food safety, that was the issue with paprika, or the way in which you classify red mud, the EU says, no, we don't want to do that. So it seems like there's very little room for reflexivity or flexibility of non-Western European economies or technologies. Oops.
I tend to agree with your position that everything that happened after the fall of state socialism in Hungary can't be blamed on state socialism. But the fact is that the reservoir was built under state
Yes.
socialism. They obviously, wouldn't be state socialist government was not as concerned about liability as a corporation that can get sued. And so, under the current business regulatory environment, would the construction of the reservoir at such geologically unstable site have been allowed?
That's a good question. When you ask questions about past sightings of toxic waste landfills, for example, you always have to ask, did they actually have enough information? And this is one thing I'm still trying to find out. Did they, in fact, in the 80s know that this was a geologically inappropriate site? I can imagine that they did, and they went ahead anyway. We certainly have examples of that from socialism. I think what you have to be careful about is, there had been 20 years since the collapse of state socialism, right? So arguably, you could have said, look, we are now living in different times. You can really lose out if we find that you do something wrong. And in fact, they didn't do anything. So you have to ask, for how many years, how many decades are you going to keep blaming things on the socialist past? So that's just a kind of theoretical question. Sorry.
You
Yeah.
mentioned that the red mud contaminated one of the tributaries of the Danube.
Yes.
And the Danube is obviously a very important river system in Europe.
Yes.
How widespread is the damage to the actual ecosystem of the Danube?
I don't think we know that yet. I mean, by the time the red mud got to the Danube, they managed to bring down the alkalinity to 8, which is pretty low. But of course, the heavy metals and other chemical compounds that in the red mud, those probably spread far and wide in the Danube. And that's something that we just probably won't see the effects of. People are constantly monitoring the wildlife and the water conditions, but we just don't know yet. You had a question? Yeah.
Talking about, they added height on those
Yes.
retaining walls. How much
Yes.
of that was post-89?
That's another thing that the company is not very forthcoming on. This is something that the residents and the employees saw, and in fact, they were quite concerned about it. I'm not sure. It's clearly happened several times since 1989. As to how many times it happened before 1989, I don't know. But that's something that I have to find out in the summer when I go back to do more research. Yes.
I'm interested about the cleanup. What sort of technologies are being utilized to clean that up and maybe do something to remediate the heavy metals that are leaching into the river system? So from sort of what you presented, it seemed like everything that's been touched by it is just going to be sort of dug up and then thrown into another pit. But is there something that's a little bit more proactive to get at the stuff that's been leaching out?
Not that I can tell. they really have concentrated in their efforts on bringing down the alkalinity. As I mentioned, they poured gypsum, and there's this new invention called humic acid, which is apparently a natural material derived from peat. And as I mentioned, they're experimenting with various grasses or wheat types. And some of these grasses can also absorb heavy metals, so they are not just good for reducing alkalinity, but can absorb heavy metals as well.
To come back to the political economic context of all this for a minute, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about the disconnect between what you call the anti-neoliberal rhetoric of the current government and its actual practice. For instance, to put it very euphemistically, the lag between the promises of compensation and the actual disbursement of this compensation to the locals. And also in the broader context, I was just wondering whether it's legitimate to refer to the current government as anti-neoliberal to full. It certainly has elements of what could be perceived as anti-neoliberal populism in its ideological agenda. But if you look at its taxation policy, for instance, it is just about as neoliberal as you could get, barring total libertarian or wrong pole type.
The personal income tax policy, so not the corporate,
Well, I mean, it's a flat tax, isn't it?
Yeah,
And
the flat tax,
it's one of the lowest in Europe at the moment.
Well, I'm not suggesting that it's actually anti-neoliberal, but I think it's a very different kind of right-wing, very different kind of conservatism than what we know from the Western context. And specifically around you mentioned this word populism. I mean, I think that's probably the best or the most commonly used political category we use for these kinds of governments. And after the initial uproar about the ridiculous amount of the compensation, the government then really kind of said, you guys have to raise the compensation. They really kind of gave in to the popular demand for higher compensation. And as I said, helping people to actually be able to buy these new homes. If you look at the local level, in Devonshire, for example, the party that's in the municipal government is Fidesz, so they're the right-wing party. But there was actually a little kind of breakup locally. There's this one particular guy who got very vocal about the fact that they allowed people to move back too fast, the fact that the compensation wasn't coming fast enough, and he, as a result, actually left this board of the municipal government and then held several press conferences with the small group of real socialists, which is TGM, Tamás Gáspár Miklós, and he's, it's not exactly a party, but it's kind of a new socialist organization. And for me, it was really fascinating to see that this guy who, by all standards, Christian, family values, conservative guy, actually found common ground with this new socialist organization, for which, of course, he took a lot of flack. So I think the ideological content of the disaster, of this kind of eco-populism that we see, is still up for grabs, and there's a lot of fluidity. And just like, feminist scholars often ask, what is the ideological content of feminism? Arguably, there are feminists on the right too. I think now we have to ask the same thing about environmentalism and certain environmental claims. We certainly see, conservative, nationalist, populist versions of environmentalism, and it will be very exciting for political and social scientists to see where this is headed. Yes?
How did the Hungarian Socialist Party react to this
Oh, they denied it. They claim that they are responsible capitalists, responsible entrepreneurs. They did everything that was asked of them, in return for knocking down the sale price. And in fact, they said that it was the state that told them to do the wrong thing, which was to build a kind of underground barrier around the reservoir to keep it from leaking out. They said that that actually kept moisture in, which weakened the walls, causing cracks. And of course, that is still being investigated, but they roundly rejected that claim that these particular socialists, very rich men, had anything to do with the disaster. Yes.
Did your client actually own some of it?
Yes.
Personally?
Personally, and he owns companies that also own shares in this company and in the mines and some of the firms that subcontract with this company. So it's a very complicated web of inter-ownership that is actually quite unique to post-socialism, but he has a clear economic business interest in this company. Yes.
Point C up there about
Yes.
the EU's irony with existing laws and their regulations. Anything in your research give you any insight to how that might play out?
Oh, I don't know. I think right now the economic and fiscal crisis of the EU has actually created an atmosphere in which it is more and more acceptable to criticize EU institutions and EU legislations. And in fact, the Fidesz government or one of their spokespersons said, we don't want the euro, for example, right? Because the way in which it's structured, it's actually not beneficial for small, not very well-to-do countries. So, and of course, a lot of other member states are also critical of the EU and the various bailouts that they did, for example, in Ireland. So I think that kind of corroding trust in the EU as a whole, as a supranational organization, might make it possible to raise these more specific questions about how the EU goes about implementing EU regulation that does not reflect the technologies that are used in Eastern Europe.
Any other questions? Okay, well, please join me in thanking our speaker once again.
Thank you.
The World Beyond the Headlines lecture series is a project of the University of Chicago Center for International Studies. Our nationally recognized programming is made possible with support from the Norman Waite Harris Memorial Fund. Download recordings of other events and learn more about the World Beyond the Headlines series at the Center for International Studies website, cis.uchicago.edu.